Welcome to the session on operations management. We are discussing on capacity and location planning. In the last class, I have given introduction to the capacity and location planning. In the last class, I have given introduction to the capacity planning, what is meant by capacity planning, what is the need of capacity planning in organizations, and then we discussed what is system capacity, what is design capacity, how to measure the capacity, what is meant by design capacity, what is meant by system capacity, what is meant by effective capacity, and then we discussed on what is the importance of capacity planning. Okay, in this class we are going to discuss on determining the capacity requirements. What is the requirement of capacities? How to determine the capacity requirements. In any organization, the capacity planning decisions involves both long-term and short-term considerations. When the capacity of a plant is decided, the manager, the person who is responsible for determining the capacity planning, he has to consider both the long-term considerations and short-term considerations. The long-term considerations are nothing but the considerations which affect the overall level of the capacity, such as facility size. What should be the size of the plant? Because once you are planned, this long-term consideration you can't change. This affects the organization in a long term. Therefore, the long-term considerations relate to the overall level of the capacity, such as facility size, whereas the short-term considerations relate to how well the capacity is used to meet the demand. That means the long-term considerations is nothing but the capacity of the plant, the size of the plant, whereas the short-term considerations nothing but how well we make use of this plant to fulfill the daily demands, the daily requirements. Okay, the long-term capacity is for the long run of the organization when the initial plant is set up. The decisions which are taken on the capacity, the long-term capacity is about the initial plant setup. Therefore, we determine long-term capacity needs by forecast demand over a time horizon. Means if you are producing certain product, what is the demand for that product? For how many years the demand for the product sustains? Based on that, we are going to decide what should be the size of the plant. First, we forecast the demand over a time horizon, and based on that forecast, the operations managers are going to decide what should be the capacity requirements, what should be the size of the plant. For this, the operations managers or any organization looks into trend and cyclical forecast. First, before deciding the capacity requirements, they go through the trend and cyclical forecast to determine the demand for the product. When the trends are identified, the fundamental issues are how long the trend might persist, because the trend may change, the demand for a product may change over the time period. Therefore, when they consider the trend for capacity requirements, the common questions that arises in the mind of operations managers are how long the trend might persist, because the few things last forever, but few things changes within a short period. Therefore, these are the questions which comes in the mind of operations manager. and the slope of the trend, whether it is in the decreasing or whether it is increasing. Similarly for the cyclic forecast also, what is the length, approximate length of the cycles, how it is changing, how the amplitude of the cycles were changing. Okay, these are the questions which are comes in the mind of operations managers when deciding the capacity requirements, when deciding the size of the capacity. Similarly, along with these are all the long-term capacity considerations. Similar to the long-term capacity considerations, the operations managers also considers the short-term capacity considerations. Short-term capacity is nothing but how we are going to deal with the current demand, how we are going to make utilization of the resources that we are having. For this, the organization looks into seasonal and random forecast. Seasonal nothing but the demand for some products changes with seasons. For cotton cloths, there is a huge demand in the summer season, but for woolen cloths, there is a huge demand in the winter season. When they are considering short-term capacity, the deal is all about how we deal with the current demand. Therefore, they consider, the operations manager looks into seasonal and random forecast to consider short-term capacity requirements. These deviations are particularly important because they can place a severe strain on system's ability to satisfy demand, because the size of the plant plays a very important role in meeting the seasonal requirements. Therefore, along with the long-term considerations, they are also consider the short-term capacity requirements while deciding or taking decisions on capacity requirements. Okay. The next concept is developing capacity alternatives. You may decided the size of the capacity based on the today's requirements or the demands, but some situations may arise where the demand for the product may increase or the decrease. For example, if the expansion of a restaurant seems like a water lines, power hookups and waste disposal lines can be put in the place initially, thereby we can reduce the cost in the future. The demand for the product may decrease. Then what are the alternatives? The things organization do to enhance the capacity management. Things means the organization to enhance the capacities, to increase the capacities or to decrease the capacities based on the demand for the product. The many things were done by the organization. The first thing is the design flexibility into the systems. Flexibility is nothing but easily we can change the systems, have provisions for the future expansions in the original design, can be obtained at a small price compared to what it would cost to remodel an existing structure. For example, in a restaurant, if you have a small restaurant, and if the demand for the restaurant increases, for your restaurant increases, the customers or increases, it is difficult if you have not proper plan to expand, to increase the size of the restaurant. Therefore, the water lines, power hookups and waste disposal lines can be put initially in your building itself, so that the small corrections can be made when the demand increases. Therefore, the design flexibility into the system plays a very important role when designing the capacity alternatives. Obtaining adjacent land, Flexible design involve layout of the equipment, location, equipment selection, production planning. All these factors plays an very important role when deciding the capacity, the size of the capacity. Design flexibility into the systems. The second factor that the operations managers are going to consider when deciding the capacity planning, when they are doing the capacity planning or when they were deciding about the capacity requirements, is the stage or life cycle of an product. Any product which was introduced into the market is having 4 phases: the introductory phase, growth phase, maturity phase, and decline phase. In the introductory phase, it is difficult to determine how the market reacts for the product. Therefore, the organization should be cautious while making large or inflexible capacity investments. But in the growth phase, the organization's share grows, which will tend to increase in the capacity, investment, and complexity. Because you are gaining when the growth phase, if the market reacts well to your product, after introductory phase, the product comes under growth phase. If the market reaction is not good, the product will get eliminated from the market. If it reaches the growth phase, the organization shares grows, means the amount which is required for the expansion comes from the sales of the product itself. Then there is a need to increase the capacity, then there is a need to increase the investment, and it involves some complexity. All these factors are to be considered. In the maturity phase, the organization tend to have a stable market, share making, full use of the capacity, and profitability. And then the product reaches decline phase due to the advancement in the technologies. Old products get eliminated from the market. In the decline phase, the organization is faced with underutilization of the capacity. In such phases, the changes are to be made in your capacity so that you can produce this new product in the same capacity or utilizing the same machines. During this phase, the organization may decide to sell excess capacity, introduce new products, or the transfer capacity to another location that has lower labor costs. All these factors are to be considered while deciding the capacity requirements so that a flexible plant can be implemented, can be started, and any changes can be made. The next factor that the organizations are to consider while deciding the capacity requirements is big picture approach. Big picture approach means we need to consider the system which is interrelated, the factors which are interrelated. When developing capacity alternatives, it is important to consider how parts of the system interrelate. For example, when making a decision to increase the number of hotels of the rooms, if the demand for the customer demand has been increased, and if you increase the number of rooms in the hotel, but what about the food, what about the housekeeping, what about the parking, whether you are having the place for parking of extra vehicles or not, you need to consider all these things also. If you are not considered all these things, and if you just increase the number of rooms in your hotel, and the system becomes unbalanced and reaches bottleneck situation where the customers may not be satisfied with your service, and the demand may decrease and it may result in loss. Therefore, the big picture approach is nothing but to consider how parts of a system are interrelated. The decision taken on one part of the system may affect the other parts. This is called big picture approach. When developing capacity alternatives, it is important to consider how parts of the system interrelate. For example, when making a decision to increase the number of rooms in a hotel, one should also take into account probable increased demands for parking, entertainment, food, and housekeeping. This is a big picture approach. The risk of not taking big picture approach is that the system will be unbalanced and possible bottleneck situation. They may reach. What is bottleneck operation? Is an operation whose capacity is lower than other capacities of other operations in the sequence. As a result, means the number of rooms may increase, but other things, other capacities such as parking, entertainment, food, housekeeping may not up to that level. As a result, the capacity of this operation limits the system capacity. The organization should work on eliminating bottleneck situations. The next one is attempt to smooth out the capacity requirements. Unevenness in the capacity requirements can create certain problems. At certain times, the system will tend to be overloaded, while at the other times it will tend to be underloaded, which tends to alternate between underutilization and overutilization of the systems. The systems that are available in your organization, sometimes they may be overloaded, sometimes they may be underloaded, they may not be work from the system. How to manage these capacity requirements? One possible approach to this problem is to identify products or the services that have complementary demand patterns. That is, patterns that tend to offset each other. Complementary demand patterns nothing but when one product is in demand, the other product is having under demand, and when the other is overloaded, the first one is underloaded. In such cases, for example, the demand for the air conditioner is greater in summer and demand for heating equipment is greater in winter, but both these products use same resources, the same power, but at different times, so that the overall capacity requirements remains stable. We need to make arrangements depending on overload and underload of the system. The next one is the identify the optimal level of operating level. Production units typically have an ideal or optimal level of operations in terms of unit cost of output. At the ideal level, the cost per unit is the lowest for that production unit. Larger or smaller rates of output will result in a higher unit cost. If your plant is manufacturing very low number of cost, if your plant is very small, whatever may be the size of the plant, it may be small, it may be medium, it may be large. When you increase the number of products, initially the cost of the product decreases up to a optimal rate. After that, again the cost of the products, the cost of unit cost of the product again increases. Means initially also when you are producing very low number of products, the cost will be higher. As you increase the number of products, the rate of output, the cost of the product decreases. It reaches some optimal rate, and again if you increase the rate of output beyond that optimal rate, again the cost of the product increases. Therefore, an operation manager is to identify what is the optimal level or the optimum rate of output for that particular plant, so that the cost of the operations, the cost of the product should be minimum. These are the factors which are to be considered by the operations manager while deciding the capacity requirements. The first one is the design flexibility, so that we can make changes depending on demand for the product. The second factor that is to be considered is the cycle of the product, so that the changes can be made depending on the cycle that the product undergoes. It may be introductory phase, growth phase, maturity phase, or declining phase. Next factor which is to be considered is big picture approach. What is big picture approach? The decisions that were taken on a capacity requirements in one system may affect the others, which unbalances the system. Therefore, we need to consider all the factors, all the systems which are interrelated. The fourth factor which is to be considered while deciding the capacity requirements is smoothing out of the capacity requirements. For example, we have considered the example of an AC and an room heater. Both are required in the different seasons, which makes use of the same resource. In such a case, smoothing of the capacity requirements we need to make, because both EAC and room heaters makes use of the same power but at different seasons. If we make some plan, the capacity requirements can be smoothed. Without increasing the capacity requirements, the same resource can be utilized. The fifth factor which is to be considered while deciding the capacity requirements is identifying the optimal operating level. Both increase in the rate of outputs and decrease in the rate of outputs increases the unit cost of the product. Therefore, a operation manager must decide what is the optimal level of output for a specific plant. By deciding these factors, by considering these factors, a good capacity planning can be made. Okay, that's all for today. We will discuss in next class.